Hello. In this video we are going to understand FSMO rules and talking about each one in detail. Talk about forest-wide and domain-wide rules. Check FSMO rules current location. Transfer FSMO rules from domain controller to another. Seize FSMO rules if a DC fails, which is a rule holder. FSMO rule is a specialized domain controller set of tasks. Flexible means that the rule can be swapped around and the administrator can decide which DC hold which rules. Single means that only one DC can hold each rule. This can apply to each domain or to the entire forest. Also, FSMO rules known as Operation Master Rules. As you know, for most Active Directory objects in Windows 2000 and later, the task of updating can be performed by any domain controller except those domain controllers that are read-only. Updates such as a computer object properties, renamed organizational units, and user account password resets can be handled by any writable domain controller. After an object is changed on one domain controller, those changes are propagated to the other domain controllers through replication. During the replication, all of the domain controllers share their updates. The ability of all domain controllers in a domain to update Active Directory and then replicate it out to the other domain controllers is referred to the multi-master replication. This model works very well for most objects in case of any conflicts, such as a user's password being reset by both the central help desk as well as an administrator working at the user's site. Then conflicts are resolved by whichever made the last change. However, there are some changes that are too important and are not well suited to this model. In previous versions of Windows such as Microsoft Windows NT 3.5 and NT 4, to prevent conflicting updates, the Active Directory performs updates to certain objects in a single master model. In this model, only one DC in the entire directory that have PDC rule, a primary domain controller, is responsible for processing all updates. In Windows NT 4, there are primary domain controllers, PDCs, and backup domain controllers, BDCs, and only one PDC can exist per domain. The PDC hosts a read and write copy of the domain database, and each BDCs host a read-only version of the same information. Microsoft extends Active Directory single master model that found in previous version of Windows to include multiple rules, FSMO rules, and the ability to transfer rules to any domain controller in the enterprise because an Active Directory rule is not bound to a single domain controller. It's referred to a flexible single master operation, FSMO rule. There are 5 FSMO rules, 2 per forest, 3 in every domain. Forest-wide rule, Schema master, and domain naming master, installed by default on the first domain controller in the forest. Domain-wide rules, RID master, PDC emulator, and infrastructure master, installed by default in the first domain controller in the domain. Let's discuss about rules in detail. Schema master. Forest wide, and there is one schema master per forest. The schema is a framework of definitions that establishes the type of objects available to Active Directory. The objects in the schema define the structure and identity of Active Directory for forest. The DC holding the rule schema master is only one in Active Directory forest that is allowed to update the schema directory. Once the update is completed, the changes are replicated to all other domain controllers in the forest. Domain naming master. Forest wide, and there is one domain naming master per forest. The DC holding the rule domain naming master is the only one in Active Directory forest that is responsible for changes in the forest wide domain naming space DNS. This means that this DC is the only one which can add or remove domain within the forest. Also add or remove trust to external directories. Add or remove application partition to or from the forest. PDC emulator is domain specific, and there is one PDC emulator per domain. The holder of the PDC emulator rule is responsible for the following tasks within a domain. Provide time service. An accurate time synchronization is necessary for purpose authentication. By default, all Windows clients in a domain retrieve their time from the domain controller owning the PDC emulator rule in their domain, and the PDC emulator is configured to gather the time from an external source. Okay? The PDC emulator also receives password updates when passwords are changed for the computer and for user accounts that are on replica domain controllers. Also, the account lookouts are processed by the PDC emulators. Also, authentication failures on any domain controller in a domain caused of a warning password are forwarded to the PDC emulator before the password failure message is reported to the user. The group management console contacts the domain controller owning this rule by default. The domain controller owning this rule should, if possible, be available all the time because an accurate time on all machines in a domain is required for purpose. RID master. Domain specific, and there is one RID master per domain. The RID master rule owner is responsible for answering RID pool requests from all domain controller within a domain. When an object such as a user, group, or computer is created in Active Directory, it's given a SID, security identifier. All security objects in a domain have a security identifier, SID, which is a combination of the SID of the domain and a sequential number called the relative ID, RID, which is supplied by the RID master. This domain controller must be online when a new domain controller is promoted in a domain to assign a RID pool. Also, it must be available when existing domain controllers update their standby RID pool. By default, 500 unique RIDs assigned from the RID master to each domain controller to allow security object to be created on all DCs if a security object is created on a domain controller. On the other side, if the RID master is offline, then it's only possible to create new security object on each domain controller until its local RID pool is empty. If the RID pools on all DC gets empty, then no further objects can be created. Also, it's not possible to join additional domain controller while the RID master of a domain controller is offline. It's also responsible for moving objects into another domain and removing them from a domain. Okay. Infrastructure master, domain specific, and there is one infrastructure master per domain. The DC owning the infrastructure master rule is responsible for updating objects SID and distinguish names in a cross-domain object reference. This is used, for example, if a user from one domain is added to a security group of a different domain. If you choose to install the rules on more than one domain controller, those domain controllers should be replication partners. There are two reasons for moving an FSMO rules from one DC to another. The first one reason is because you want to, that is, and the movement is planned for some reason, such as decommissioning a server that holds one or more of the FSMO rules, and it's called transferring the rule. The other reason to move a rule when you might be forced to move a rule when a server that holds one or more FSMO rules has suffered hardware failure, and it's called seizing the rule. You should never seizing a rule unless you absolutely have to. Transferring a rule can be done either through the graphic user interface GUI or through the command line interface. Let's first look at transferring a rule. Permissions. Before you can transfer a rule, you must have the appropriate permissions depending on which rule you plan to transfer. Domain naming master require enterprise admin group. Schema master, you should be member of schema admin group. Infrastructure master require domain admins group. PDC emulator require domain admins group. RID master require domain admins group. Okay, now let's go to transfer FSMO rules. The transferring can only be done if the original domain controller is alive on the network. If a domain controller hosting a single operation master rules is no longer available, you will not be able to transfer that rule to another domain controller. Open PowerShell to determine FSMO rule holder server. Type netdom query FSMO. As shown, the domain controller that holds FSMO rules is lab-dc-01. From Server Manager, open Tools, select Active Directory User and Computers, right-click, select Operation Masters. As you see, all domain-wide rules hold in lab-dc-01. Press the change button. Cannot transfer as we must connect to the target domain controller to be able to transfer. We connected to lab-dc-01. Right click, change domain controller, select target domain controller, lab-dc-02. Okay, now we connected to lab-dc-02. Again, right click, operation masters, RID rule hold in lab-dc-01. Press the change button, yes, to confirm. The rule transferred successfully to lab-dc-02. Go to PDC rule, change, yes, okay. Go to infrastructure, change, yes, okay. Let's check now by using netdom command. As you see, the domain-wide rules RID, PDC, PDC, and infrastructure move to lab DC-02. Only schema and domain naming master still on lab-DC-01. Go to server manager, open tools, select Active Directory domain antitrust. Already I'm connected to lab-DC-02. Right click, Operation Masters. As you see, domain naming master hold in lab-DC-01. Change, yes, OK. Check again by using netdom command. Domain naming master move to lab-DC-02. Only schema master still on lab-DC-01. To transfer the schema master, we should register the schema DLL library by using this command. Done. Registered now. OK. Type MMC to open MMC console. File. Select Add Remove Snapping. Select the Active Directory schema. Add. OK. Right click. Select Operation Master. We connected to lab-DC-01. We need to connect to target server. Right click, change domain controller. Select lab-DC-02. OK. Again, right click, Operation Masters. Change. Yes. OK. The rule transferred successfully. Go to PowerShell. Check by using netdom command. Now all rules moved successfully to another domain controller and all rules now on lab-DC-02. Now let's see how to seize FSMO rules. As mentioned, if a domain controller hosting a single operation master rule is no longer available, you will not be able to transfer that rule to another domain controller and to move that rules to another domain controller by seizing the rule. Seizing a rule can only be done through the command line interface using ntdsutil.exe. It's extremely important to remember two things about seizing FSMO rule. 1. Never seize a rule unless it's your last resort. If a domain controller hosting a rule is only going to be down temporarily, don't worry about it. Your network will survive a short time without seizing. Number 2. If the rule is seized from a domain controller, that domain controller must never be allowed to come back online again. You should take FSMO rules seriously, and the admin need to understand where the rules are located and how to transfer the rule if an outage is planned, or how to seize a rule if the outage is unplanned. I moved all FSMO rules to lab-DC-01. Also, it's disconnected from the network now. Login to lab-DC-02. Open PowerShell. netdom query FSMO to determine FSMO rule holder server. As shown, all FSMO rules on lab-DC-01. Let's check if we can transfer first. Tools, Active Directory User and Computers. Right click, Operation Master. as you see, take long time to define the rule. Finally, we received error. Cannot define FSMO rule holder server. PDC, the same error. Press to change to transfer. Cannot transfer because the domain controller hosting a rule is no longer available in the network. Also, if we check all rules, we will get error too. And the only way to move the rule to another domain controller is to ceasing. Okay, go to PowerShell. Type in tdsutil rules question mark to see a list of available commands at any of the prompts in the ntdsutil tool. Connections to connect to domain controller. Connect to server lab-dc-02. Connected to lab-dc-02. Q to quit. Cease schema master. Confirmation message. Yes. ntdsutil will first try to transfer the rule. This should time out and fail, and then actual seizure will occur. Seizing completed. Type cease domain naming master. The same steps. Yes. Seizing completed. Seize PDC. Yes. Completed. Seize RID master. Yes. Seizing completed. Seize infrastructure master. Yes. Seizing all FSMO rules completed. Q to quit. Go to Active Directory User and Computers. Right click Operation Masters. As you see, the FSMO rules now on lab-dc-02, RID, PDC, and infrastructure. Open PowerShell. Check by using netdom query FSMO command. As shown, all FSMO rule on lab-dc-02. Okay. I hope you have enjoyed. Many thanks and see you in the next video.